Dear God, as we begin a new year, may we feel refreshment and courage and the energy we need to do your work. Amen. So I'm going to begin with a scherzo. So, little joke. Here's a cartoon. Okay, can I have just a little more volume, please? There we go. Okay, two cavemen are sitting outside their cave making stone tools. One says to the other, "Something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and look, nobody lives past 30. And that joke reflects a very common view of ancient lifespans, right? But according to the best information, it's based on kind of a myth, because people in the past were not all dead by 30 or 40. Actually, ancient documents point this out. 4,400 years ago, an Egyptian poet wrote verses about the troubles of old age. And the ancient Greeks wrote of old age as a divine curse, and their tombstones attest to survival beyond 80, sometimes well beyond 80. There's also contemporary evidence to back this up. Studies of tribal people who lived far away from modern medicines in such places as Tanzania and remote regions of the Amazon have demonstrated that most likely age of death is far higher than most people assume. It's probably about 70. Now, I begin with this because I want to try and establish what midlife might be now, and also in the remote past. By popular definition, midlife is deemed to be between the ages of 40 and 60, but today, with life expectancy lengthening, it's probably closer to 45 to 65. And let me say that midlife is more than a mathematical demarcation. I think it's a psychological and sociological one too. I remember somewhere between 42 and 45 is the time when I quit looking up to people I admired and began to think that I was in some ways their peer. I'd begun to measure up. But just as one senses that one's mental maturity is finding footing, one can't help but notice the body beginning to weaken some, right? The stamina that you used to have just isn't there anymore. And of course, one begins to think differently about the future, right? You don't worry about your demise maybe quite yet, unless, of course, you're ill. But you find yourself unable to take seriously some dreams that you used to have. You know, that one day that you would eventually fill in the blank. I had improved all aspects of my golf game into my 40s, but I was becoming more and more sure that I was not going to be entering the senior tour at the age of 50. And as for our more realistic dreams, they too become less realizable due to the choices that we've made. There are the needs of a marriage partner, of course, or the demands of child rearing, or the requirements of a career path. You feel it might be too late to start something brand new. This may or may not be true, of course, but you feel the specific gravity of that anyway. Middle age brings with it a foretaste, of course, of death, the ultimate closing of doors on our future, which, of course, is why some people may feel a little desperation at this time of life. A now or never feeling begins to set in. The choices you make in the face of this can be healthy or they can be unhealthy, right? Depending on who you are, of course. This is where we get the term midlife crisis. But I think that term is overhyped. I mean, anyone who is alive and paying attention to their own life right, is bound to think it's now or never from time to time. You may feel it a little too early, or you may feel it a little too late. I remember a woman who decided she needed to find a husband fast. She was 23. That seemed a bit hasty, and in fact it was too hasty. A long ago, before we had terms like midlife crisis, a man named Moses, well, he had one. He was born a Jew at a time when it was really a lousy time to be born one. There were better times, maybe during the reign of King David or Solomon, for instance, but not during Moses' time. During Moses' time, all the Jewish people, according to the story, were born into slavery. But also in the providence of God, Moses found himself adopted into a highborn Egyptian family. Pharaoh's family, in fact, and he had a luxurious upbringing. Unlike his Hebrew family, Moses never knew want, he only knew privilege. It didn't include an Audi or a laptop computer or other things of wealth, but it was still pretty darn cushy. But there comes a time when the book of Exodus, where this story comes from, says that he had, quote, grown up. Now, we aren't told how old he is, but in another book of the Bible where he's referred to, the book of Acts, they say he's 40. Now, maybe that's just the writer of Acts' way of saying Moses says, is at a point in his life where a person begins to get introspective, starts asking himself questions about who he is and who he is not. Whatever his age, Moses was at a place in life where he began to connect the dots about his life, right? I'm sure he was not raised like the Buddha, who was brought up behind a high wall by a very controlling father who didn't want him to see death or illness or old age. Remember that story? No, it looks like Moses was free to see everything going on in Pharaoh's kingdom, and what he saw was slave drivers beating slaves with no mercy, and that is, in actual fact, what he saw on this day in question in today's text. Now, I doubt very much that it was the first time he'd seen this kind of treatment. I doubt it was the first time that seeing it bothered him. What made the day unique was that this was the day when enough was finally enough for him, and Moses could no longer just look away and go on about his royal business. It was a day when he could no longer look at himself in his little shaving mirror and ignore what he sensed was a gross injustice. Somehow, whatever filters Moses had used that worked for the first 40 years of his life would no longer suffice. He could no longer turn a blind eye to things that before he was so very used to seeing. Why? Why now? Because maybe somewhere around 40, we come into our own as human beings. If we are healthy at that age, we begin to embrace who we believe we are and let go of identities that we know finally are limited or inauthentic. Moses let go of his false Egyptian pedigree and embraced his Hebrew roots. But here's the most interesting part of this. Notice that in the text there's something that signals to us that there may be a step that comes before a person embraces the new. This is really important. That step is, as you might imagine, the disengagement step. And here is the part of the story I'm talking about. At the end of this morning's passage, we hear that Moses, having run away from Pharaoh's court, hides in the hinterlands with a third ethnic group, the Midianites. He becomes a shepherd and is invited to marry a Midianite young woman named Zipporah. Then in verse 22 we read, she bore a son, and he, Moses, named him Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. which of course is what Gershom means. I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. Now, of course, living in Midian, Moses is estranged from both his Hebrew brothers and sisters and his adopted Egyptian family as well. But there is clearly more going on here. To wake up in midlife and feel an alien in a foreign land is a metaphor, of course, right? It is to know in your bones what it feels like to become maybe a stranger to your own self. That can happen right there in the middle. That's what's going on inside Moses at this disengagement stage. He had grown up firmly identified, of course, as an Egyptian prince, a totally unique, privileged individual. But now he had become a common shepherd and someone who would blend in with millions of others, of course. But neither of these was who he really was. He'd become an alien to who he had been and who he was yet to become. It would take him a while to mature even further. But in the meantime, it was okay for him to hide out in shepherd's garb with only the responsibilities of a small-time animal raiser and a young family man. It's a necessary and formative time of respite for him. Now, for comparison's sake, let me remind you of the story of the Apostle Paul. He was raised a religious Jew in a corner of Turkey. He claimed Roman citizenship. He fulfilled an early dream to become a prominent Pharisee. And as a young man, he identified as a proud persecutor of Christians, remember? He stood by and watched as others stoned prominent saints like one named Stephen. Now, does this story sound a little familiar? Because it's Moses' story. Moses stood by and watched as Hebrews were whipped and killed. Both men did the same thing, identifying with the upper echelons of their societies into which they were born privileged. They both benefited from injustice, therefore. That is, until conscience kicked in, until they could no longer look on. Until they were fed up and said, enough is enough. And then they parted company with themselves, their old selves. Think about that. Has that ever happened to you? At a midlife place, maybe in a small way, you left something behind. You saw something you hadn't seen before. You opened your heart. This led to a time of walking in the wilderness for both Moses and Paul. And that's interestingly where both end up for a time before they become the real great liberators that they will eventually become. Each has an encounter with God. Paul's is so poignant. The risen Jesus Christ appears out of nowhere and says to him, Paul, or Saul, actually, that was his former name. Saul, why do you persecute me? Why do you kick against these goads? That is, why do you perpetuate the injustice that your best self detests? And the dam breaks as it broke for Moses. Moses, too, had an encounter with God. All we know is that he went back to Egypt and became Charlton Heston, right? The great liberator and lawgiver of Israel. Stuff happens in life, and these speed bumps that we hit on the way to old age, they're not easy for anybody. C.S. Lewis once warned that middle age was, quote, excellent campaigning weather for the devil. Well, midlife awakenings are a testing time in life, but look, every stage in a life is a testing time. The tests simply change, and blaming it on the devil is to miss, I think, what's often a necessary threshold to growth. That's what we're looking at. I mean, look, Lewis himself had a midlife reset. If you know his life, he thought himself a confirmed bachelor, and all that changed when he was 58. He must have wondered at first if meeting an American woman writer and thinker that he cared about was the work of God or something more sinister. In the end, he believed Joy Davidman to be a gift from God. Well, there is often, if not always, some opportunity for rebirth that comes somewhere in the middle of our lives. Some people embrace it. Many, out of fear, perhaps do their best to ignore those impulses and just continue to accommodate themselves to where they have come from. I mean, consider the pressures to accommodate that Moses must have felt outwardly and inwardly. Though it's never said, might there have been the expectation that he would become the next Pharaoh? I mean, look, someone intent on becoming Pharaoh couldn't work to undermine the slave system that everything was built on. Then there was the inner pressure he would feel living a massively privileged life, right? I've heard it said that every one of us in this room lives a better life than the richest of Egypt's pharaohs did. But still, it must have been amazing being 1 in 100,000 to have hot water and the best food anybody could eat every single day. Not easy for him to give up. Now, let me discuss a much more common midlife wake-up call. One that does not involve a bad conscience. A few years ago, when I lived in Utah, the Salt Lake Tribune ran a piece on depression. The article said that depression manifests most typically in Utah this way: in 50-year-old Utah women. 90% of Utah women, it said, spend their whole marriages submitting to their husbands. Not like slaves to a king, exactly. This usually manifested subtly. The women had been told since they were little that submission was the rule, and they'd had that modeled for them by their mothers. These women simply let their husbands be the main act. And then, according to the article, many began waking up in their late 40s, wondering what had become of their young dreams. Now, this isn't exclusively an experience of Utah women, or even just women, though it's common. I mean, even Barbie goes through it in the movie. Many people, both men and women, have at least a slight midlife malaise, right? Here are a couple of examples. The first is from a woman named Ada Calhoun, author of the book Why We Can't Sleep: Women's New Midlife Crisis. She says, "In my experience, Gen X women spend lots of time minimizing the importance of their uncomfortable or confusing feelings. They often tell me that they are embarrassed to even bring them up. Some of the unhappiest women I spoke with, no matter how depressed or exhausted they were, apologized for whining. Almost every one of them also described herself as lucky." The next portrait comes from a man named John Darnielle. He says, of midlife, "I remember feeling like there wasn't all that much to say about my life. I'd had several satisfying relationships. They hadn't amounted to much. I'd gotten better at my work and been rewarded for it, but I sometimes felt that life had run out of surprises for me. I did what I did and got the results I expected. I kept up my practice, and it paid my way. My wheels made an agreeable noise when they spun." Just a subtle awakening to our wheels spinning in the dust. Now, Let me share some wisdom from a psychologist named Marcia Reynolds. It's from a short piece she wrote called How to Get Through a Midlife Crisis, 5 Hints from a 73-year-old Woman Who's Been There. On a particular day when she was 50, Marcia says that the filters that she'd used for decades no longer worked for her. Her previous sense of who she was suddenly just seemed inauthentic. And here are 5 questions she says she realized had been plaguing her for years. 1, what did I feel I should have accomplished by that time in my life? 2, was there something more important and fulfilling that I could focus on? 3, what did I want more of in my life? 4, what had I imprisoned that was crying to be free? 5, how could I ensure my commitment to living a significant life? She adds to this all, I didn't know the answers to any of these questions. All I knew was that on that particular day, finding the answer to them became real for me. Well, here's her advice on how to get through should you be facing that kind of passage yourself. 1, she says, don't believe anyone who tells you that you have no right to be unhappy with your life. 2, it's okay to lose your equilibrium when others think your life should be smooth sailing. 3, it is okay to lose, I just read that one. 3, it is okay to question your life's purpose. 4, it's okay to say, I don't know who I am. 5, it's better to ask the question and seek the answers than to live a numb life. A numb life. Moses and Saul must have asked themselves similar questions. Well, here is Marcia Reynolds' last word of wisdom on this. She says, sometimes we have to lose ourselves to find ourselves. Which sounds to me so like the wisdom of Jesus, doesn't it? You have to lose yourself to find yourself. And like the wisdom of Jesus, it sounds scary. But here's the deal. Once you come out of the wilderness of midlife, life gets better for almost everyone. It can actually even get easier. Happiness levels, this has been repeatedly shown, seem to follow a U-shaped curve with their lowest point in the mid-40s, after which they rise as people move into older age. People in midlife can find firmer ground to stand on. They can figure out who they are, and they can let go of who they are not, which is just as important. They can get comfortable in their own bodies and their own lives. They can come to own their own choices. They can finally get past the expectations others have set down for them over the decades. And they can begin doing what actually makes them happy. And if, like Moses and Paul, they aren't narcissists, they can begin working to make the world what they believe it should be too, not what their parents told them it ought to be. Amen.